Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, we're going to take a look back at the last 4 years of Thinking Deeply About Primary Education as we're at the Christmas break and starting to reflect on the things that have happened this year. Tadape will be 4 years old. 4 full years old, I should say, as we move into 2025. And so what I've done is I've taken 4 questions from the 4 most listened to episodes over the last 4 years. And one of the things that really struck me as I looked at, you get those updates about what your year was like, and podcasters get those too. And essentially something like 50% of listeners this year were new to the podcast. I'm thinking, okay, 4 years is a long time. And so there may be things which I thought were really, really good, but you may not have heard before. Now, obviously, those of you who have been listening from the start will be familiar, but it might be nice to be reminded of some of the things that we discussed. And so I'm going to try and make this a feature within 2025, choosing questions from the back catalogue and releasing them in addition to the episodes that we have every week. So this is 2021 to 2024. The 4 most listened to episodes, 1 question from each. Might be time to go back and check them out if you've forgotten about them, or if they're now relevant to what you're thinking deeply about. All that's left to do is say have a wonderful winter break. I hope you enjoy the time off. Take time to relax. Don't think about work for a substantial amount of the next couple of weeks, and we'll see you every week in 2025. Thanks for listening. I think, Chris, the first question I've got for you is, why are multiplication facts and their related division facts essential?
Well, I think the first thing to note is just how ubiquitous they are within our teaching. Once they are learned, or even while they're being learned, we immediately realize that they're everywhere. So when you're dealing with fractions, percentages, proportional reasoning, they just come up again and again and again. And of course they do, because if you think of all the circumstances under which multiplication is useful, and we think about the fact that at primary school, we're not really using calculators under any circumstances. If we're going to be dealing with something that revolves around multiplication, we're going to be relying on our multiplication facts. So the fact that they come up again and again in various aspects of the curriculum is one of the reasons why they're essential. I mean, in terms of what makes learning them as facts, kind of committing them to memory, essential, we go back to that simple model of memory idea, this idea that we want to be able to free up cognitive resources, free up working memory by having them committed to long-term memory so that we can concentrate on the pertinent and more challenging, perhaps, aspects of a mathematics question or a mathematics problem. The phrase that you use so often about being able to then do more interesting mathematics because you've got that foundation secure. On a slightly cynical note, the multiplication table check exists. And so teachers across the country will be thinking about how to deal with multiplication facts and the related division facts with their kids for that reason. But obviously that's not the core of why we do what we do. But I think it would be silly not to mention that. But really, it's just how useful they are, how common they come up in the curriculum. But even beyond the learning of mathematics in a formal sense, they are just a really useful bit of knowledge for day-to-day existence, being able to deal with groups of stuff quickly, being able to calculate with groups of stuff quickly without having to get your phone out, proves itself to be quite a useful thing to do. So yeah, those are where I would start when thinking about why multiplication and the related division facts are essential. What have I missed? There's bound to be bits and pieces.
I think there's one thing to say before I sort of give my opinion, and it's that we're at the precipice. You mentioned the multiplication check. It's going to now become something that schools are in some way going to be held accountable for. Certainly the people who will be able to see the data will be ourselves, potentially the local authority, and certainly Ofsted. And so Charlotte McKechnie was talking to me about how the phonics check is not the aim of the game. It's not the end goal. Right now, we have the chance to say that we're not going to make the same mistake with multiplication check. Because if we start saying how many children have passed or putting an arbitrary benchmark in place, then we invite unwelcome accountability. And I think now is the time. Much easier said than done. And I accept that it is extremely important that all our pupils know their times tables, particularly going into year 5 and 6, because of the reasons you outlined. You don't get to do the wonderful stuff with fractions and ratio if you don't know your tables. But we as a profession, particularly in primary, have the chance now to say, no, we're going to use this data properly. We're going to use this because it's diagnostic, isn't it? As far as I can remember. I mean, it's been a while since I read the paperwork because we've had 2 sort of stalled years. But it's supposed to be okay, right? These children don't know these tables. Let's do something about it and nothing more. And I really hope that it doesn't become, 75% of pupils have met the expected standard in the multiplication check, because there is no expected standard.
Yeah, and we know what schools are like with what can be like with data. Let's hope it doesn't go that way. But I think what you mentioned there about year 5, 6, it's the idea of saying this is a good time to keep an eye on where children are at with their multiplication tables, regardless of the check. If the government cancelled the check tomorrow, I would still say to schools, it's a really good point. End of year 4 is a really good point to know where your children are at with multiplication tables. Because like you say, the fractions stuff in year 5, and there's a lot of it, assuming you follow the rough trajectory as is portrayed in the national curriculum. There's a lot of fraction stuff in year 5. And it really comes down to, can you deal fluently with equivalent fractions? And equivalent fractions, and so simplifying, etc., and dealing with equivalent fractions is entirely based on or almost entirely based on the fluency of your multiplication and related division facts. And if you've got them down, the teaching of that bit of fractions is so much more enjoyable, and children just pick it up so much quicker. So yeah, it's a really good time, regardless of the check, to have a little think about whether kids are ready for what goes on in year 5.
And in terms of why they're essential, I think you've hit all the key markers. So I'm going to speak hypothetically. Is there an argument to be made that most of mathematics that we'll encounter, certainly in school, are just extended metaphors of the laws of arithmetic that apply to multiplication? And so you're just seeing applications of the same ideas?
I'd say a lot of it is. I'd say a lot of the stuff that relates directly to arithmetic is going to be built on, the basic operations. I mean, when you're getting into the trickier stuff where you're starting to apply, say, the distributivity of multiplication over addition, again, that stuff is just, the basis of multiplication and understanding how multiplication operates in the ways that it's combined with addition. So much of the mathematical problem solving that doesn't feel like it's related to that is, as you say, just an extension of that idea, which obviously is itself related to multiplication. I think there are obviously bits and pieces related to arithmetic that don't necessarily have multiplication at its heart, but it's so central to scaling, proportional reasoning, algebra, etc., 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 that it does feel like the heart of a lot of the mathematics, a lot of the arithmetic that comes later, and not having a bank of memorized multiplication and division facts that you can bring to bear in order to deal with that is a major impediment where it's not there.
I can't remember what it was I was reading, but I think it was Marcus de Sotoy, who I'm a massive fan of his work. I've mentioned him a few times in the what you're reading for section. He said about how he didn't necessarily feel he had automatic recall, and I think it's a potentially dangerous narrative because he, on the other hand, discovered a Platonic solid, and most people who don't know their times tables can't make that same claim. So I think there's a dangerous narrative around knowing and the importance of knowing, and I think we're drawing a line in the sand. The rest of your life, particularly your time in school, will be much more enjoyable if you know your multiplication facts by the time you're 9 years old.
And this is going to bring us on to something that I'm sure we're going to discuss later. It's like, well, which multiplication facts? Because my mum was at school, she would have been dealing with pounds, shillings, and pence. So because you've got an aspect of imperial currency, knowing your 16 times table, for example, your 16s, your 14s, your 12s, etc., was a particularly valuable thing and was part of the required, as it were, set of facts that pupils were taught. Whereas now we stop at 12s. And again, it's something I'm going to bring up later, but I guess there is a question about, well, what do we mean? Which set of facts? Personally, when I'm thinking about this, I'm automatically assuming that we're doing what most schools do, which is up to 12 and not necessarily beyond. But again, that might be whether we go beyond and how exactly we think about going beyond that, and whether even the 11 times table and the 12 times table are as essential as the rest in terms of memorization might be something that we get into.
I've often read about countries like Germany where they've got 99.9% literacy. Do you reckon it's an English language issue, or systemic, or maybe something different? Is it possible for a country where English is the official language to reach close to 100%, or as close as is reasonably possible?
I strongly suspect it is, but this is not to disrespect the teachers of our country. The nature of written English, and this is something that I'm no doubt we'll get into a little more detail later, is that it is exceptionally difficult to teach for a whole variety of reasons. The fact that we have to deal with English on the basis of phonemes, we have to get down to the smallest units of sound. The fact that our language has a real high level of orthographic depth, which means effectively that the connections between the symbols of our writing and the sounds that are represented by that writing there isn't this lovely one-to-one correspondence as there is with lots of languages. It's really fascinating you bring up Germany, because, for example, in Germany, the way that a struggling reader is judged after a couple of years has almost nothing to do with how many words they can decode. It's almost entirely based around speed, because the decoding is so much easier to do because of this tight correspondence between the sounds and the symbols. Now, there are other factors that then come into play later on with German and with other languages. But in those initial stages of decoding, there's almost no language in the world that is as difficult to learn and difficult to teach as English. That said, it's very difficult to put an estimate on it, but I personally think that there's no reason why all but a very, very small minority of people shouldn't be able to learn to decode to a competent extent, an extent that allows them to develop towards fluent reading.
Of all the things that there are to know about reading comprehension and all the things we discussed, what might the 5 most important things be for teachers to know? So I don't know, if probably take a more discussion-based approach to this episode. We'll throw as many different ideas into the ring, and then we'll sort of try and decide on those top 5, and it might help people, I don't know, focus their CPD priorities for 2023-24 to thinking, okay, if my teachers know these 5 things, we'll be in a really good place to start. So I don't know, Chris, if I can throw it your way, what do you reckon one thing could be that people need to know?
So I think a really good place to start are the enabling conditions that allow for comprehension in the first place. So before we get into the details of how we might think about comprehension, the interconnected bodies of knowledge that underpin it, it's worth thinking about what else needs to be in place in order for comprehension to stand a chance. And if we think to basically every model or every framework there is for describing reading, one thing that is included in there is the idea that in order for reading comprehension to take place, pupils need to have a level of expertise in recognizing words, and in particular, they need to be relatively fluent in their reading. What we mean by that is if the words aren't flowing, to some extent at least, then too much of a pupil's cognitive resources then have to be devoted to that process of word recognition, and there's too little of those, or too few of those cognitive resources that are left to be devoted to the challenging act of comprehending text. So I'd say, like, perhaps one of the most important things to know about comprehension is that it is underpinned by reading fluency, this flow of words as we read. Now, it's tempting to look at it in just those terms, but I think it's also worth noting that there is, of course, a reciprocal relationship between fluency and comprehension, because, as I've said, fluency supports comprehension, but equally, the more that we comprehend, the more the reading itself can flow. So there is this reciprocal relationship, this virtuous cycle between the two.
Absolutely agree with everything that Chris has said there, unsurprisingly for this particular topic. Again, just worth bearing in mind, I think, this idea that it's perhaps a lethal mutation. I'm not sure, maybe not, maybe that's unfair, but it's quite easy to kind of get some sort of magic number into your head, as opposed to what the reading fluency, words correct per minute, if that's it's the common metric that many people use. That passing that kind of abstract number means kind of like job done, and like I can lay off the reading fluency practice now, which really isn't the case, evidently. And we'll go into this a little bit more detail once the kind of text structures and get more complex. It's likely that fluency will drop a little bit because they're just not used to that structure of the text. Likewise as well, the type of genre that you're reading could impact it. I know, for example, thinking back to kind of my own experiences as a reader back in secondary school, whenever we were in drama and reading Shakespeare, he starts every line with a capital letter, whether it's the end of a sentence or not. And so that kind of really stunts your fluency of reading that passage, because at that point, you've seen a capital letter so long, you just assume that, right, I'm going to take a stop. Because obviously a new sentence is starting, and obviously that massively changes the way that you might pronounce a particular phrase, sentence, paragraph, whatever it might be. And so it's kind of really important to, I think, keep in the back of our minds when it comes to reading fluency, this idea that it's a continuum. It's not a kind of you get through the door with it and then it's like jobs are good, and it's something that you kind of always have to be thinking and considering. And I'm sure those teachers who have taught year 6 and have taken year 6 through various different SATs papers, they've experienced that firsthand, where some of their fluent readers perhaps haven't quite got through as much of the paper that they thought they would. And one of the reasons might be because I'm thinking particularly back to I can't remember what year it was, but the music box, that was quite a thick, dense text, where if you're reading fluency really wasn't up to par, that would have impacted you massively. So I think that would be the only thing that I'd add on to Chris's idea. Then it can't exist without comprehension, can't exist without it, but equally it's important to kind of remember in the back of our heads that it's not a simple yes, they're fluent enough, no, they're not. There's a kind of a whole wider continuum behind reading fluency that's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, and it's also, as you've alluded to there, text specific, to the point where, for example, there is this temptation to think, okay, these kids aren't fluent yet, and so comprehension isn't going to happen to the level I'd want it to, so let's not worry so much about comprehension, which firstly would be, it's a very silly way to think about things, because you can always be developing the bodies of knowledge upon which comprehension is based. But equally, you can recognize that with the text that a pupil has in front of them, that, okay, so maybe they're not fluent with the first time through of reading it, but they don't have to just read it once. That might be what we do for assessment, but that doesn't have to be what we do in a given reading lesson. We can take a chunk of text and say, you know what, we are going to read it repeatedly. We're going to develop fluency. I'm going to, for this text, I'm going to, model it to you. And as well as that, developing fluency more generally, it seems to research suggests there's this kind of transfer effect here. It also allows pupils to comprehend the text that's in front of them in a way that they would be able to do were they more fluent the first time they read it. So as well as there being this continuum of fluency, it's also the case that it's kind of specific to the text that's in front of the pupil, not just in terms of how difficult it is, but also their own familiarity with the words, the sentence structure, the way it's put together. So we can take advantage of this more flexible understanding of fluency to support comprehension in the lessons that we teach. But yeah, that's at heart, key thing. Comprehension is underpinned by a certain level of reading fluency. So if you've got kids in your class who are struggling with comprehension, don't just assume that it is because they don't understand the vocabulary of the text or the sentence structure. It really might just be that the words aren't flowing to in a great enough extent in terms of the pace, in terms of the prosody, etc., that will allow them to comprehend it.
Yeah, I think it's worth just being really clear. When we say fluency, we're talking about the kind of three strands. We're talking about automaticity, prosody, and accuracy. So obviously, you could be really fluent and have good prosody, but if your accuracy, that might be a particular strand within it that, really is going to let you down. And I think I kind of saw it mentioned in a couple of articles, how, actually the accuracy that, potentially can make a lot of that difference between that comprehension being there, being able to occur and not. So definitely worth keeping in mind about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're not decoding the words correctly, what chance do you have, in the end? And it's tempting to skip ahead. It's tempting to look at parts of reading fluency and say, well, you know what? Let's see if we can focus on pace or focus on prosody. If you're not recognizing the words on the page accurately, then it's something wrong that's flowing, and so the chances of it actually making sense to you are fairly limited.
How can assessment be used to help us support struggling readers?
Obviously, from what I've said there about there being these aspects of knowledge and skills that are less well developed relative to their peers, it makes it clear that we need to know what these aspects of knowledge and skills are that aren't there, which says, okay, so how do we find out? And there is an extent to which the day-to-day classroom teaching that we do can support us in recognizing those things. You work with a group of pupils day in, day out, you begin to recognize whether they have issues relating to recognizing individual words, whether they can what their vocabulary is like, what their knowledge of the world is like, whether they have experiences with different kinds of texts, etc., etc. That said, we shouldn't be relying upon that. When we're thinking about a school-wide basis, what we really need is something systematic. And by that, I mean something that engages with every pupil and does so in a predictable way. It shouldn't be the case that we only find out about a pupil's issues with decoding polysyllabic words or reading fluency or whatever it might be because a teacher has got, is eagle-eyed and particularly sensitive to this stuff. Like I say, it's really helpful for teachers to understand reading and the bodies of knowledge and skills that underpin it so that they can support with these informal assessments. But we need something systematic. Now, what does that look like? In most primary schools that I've seen at the moment, there is something systematic in place, but only in how it relates to standardized reading comprehension assessments. It tends to be the case that most schools have got an assessment like, NFER or GL or all sorts of companies available, where you will do a comprehension assessment and it will spit out the other side of it a reading age. And in some cases, it will attempt to spit out things like, oh, this person struggles with answering retrieval questions or making predictions. And for those who have listened to the previous podcasts, you'll understand why I think that kind of stuff is a pretty bogus way of looking into kids' reading. But what it does do is provide us, as I say, with things like reading ages, a standardized score relating to comprehension. Now, thinking about how we started the podcast, you'll recognize that, of course, that's still relative. A reading age of 8 years and 3 months just means that a kid that's where like an average 8 years, 3-month-old child will be, but it's still useful information, not least for, thinking about whether your reading curriculum is generally doing what you want it to do. What it isn't useful for, particularly, is working out exactly what aspects of reading a pupil is struggling with. It can tell us that there's maybe an issue. It can tell us that a pupil is potentially significantly behind where we would hope them to be, but it can't tell us why. And this is where other aspects need to come into our systematic way of addressing reading comprehension. But we have to be pragmatic. We could do 10, 15, 20 different kinds of assessment, looking at aspects of vocabulary and aspects of text structure, etc. But that's never going to happen. It's going to take too long, and we're going to lose actual time to do the teaching because we're always assessing. So what do we need other than comprehension in this systematic approach? Well, I would make the argument, and I know many others would as well, that we need some kind of fluency assessment in there. Now, you can find fluency assessments online, things like Dibels, and there are products you can buy, and in some cases they look really sensible and useful. But at heart, a fluency assessment is you just hearing a pupil read from a roughly age-appropriate text and working out roughly how many words correct per minute they are reading. Now, you can compare that again roughly to their peers, and it will give you a sense of where their reading fluency is at, especially if you combine that with an understanding of what's their prosody like. In other words, when they're reading aloud, does it sound like a natural spoken voice compared to their peers? Obviously, we'll generally expect a more developed sense of prosody from a 10-year-old than we would from a 7-year-old, for example. But you can hear a pupil read aloud for a little period of time, get a sense of roughly how quickly they're reading, how accurate that reading is, and whether it sounds like a natural spoken voice. And the useful thing about this is it begins to tell you what to do next. So let me talk about this a little bit more. If their fluency looks fine, it's not significantly troubling you compared to a pupil's peers, then they're probably on track with their reading. But if the one thing to keep an eye on is if their fluency seems fine relative to their peers, but comprehension definitely isn't, it's way out of line with that, then there might be a couple of things to look at. It might be that vocabulary or background knowledge is something to look into. It might also be, and this happens very occasionally, it might also be that their comprehension is something that they've not really taken charge of. They've done lots of reading where they're kind of reading aloud, and they just haven't developed this sense that making sense of text is what they're supposed to do. And you can support that sense of responsibility, this sense of active comprehension, by thinking about teaching them comprehension strategies. Now, you can do that in the classroom, you can do that in interventions, but what you're effectively doing there is getting them to do things like summarize bits of text, ask questions about bits of text, just awakening them to the idea that they need to make sense of text themselves. Now, that's what you should do in the rare case where you've got a relatively fluent reader, but comprehension isn't where you want it to be. But that's pretty rare. Now, the real reason, or the main reason why fluency assessments are such a valuable part of this systematic approach is what you can do then when you realize that a pupil's fluency isn't where you want it to be. It is significantly behind age-related expectations. It's significantly behind their peers. Because let's say you've got 20% of pupils who you think, yeah, fluency really isn't where I want it to be for this age group. You now have a group of pupils that you can target other forms of assessment at. In particular, you can say, well, I'm going to look at their decoding of individual words. I'm going to see whether they have the code knowledge that allows them to recognize words, whether they can blend sounds within words, whether they can blend phonemes. Is that an issue? And it commonly is. Or perhaps they're fine with that, but they struggle with polysyllabic words, decoding words with multiple syllables. And maybe that's what you want to work on. Or maybe you realize that actually they're fine with all of that. Decoding individual words, great, no problem. But they're still disfluent compared to where I'd expect them to be at this stage of in their education. So maybe they need practice. They need fluency. They need practice in which is monitored, which is guided, which perhaps has some modeling as part of it to make sure that they're developing reading fluency. So in short, the great thing about having fluency as the centerpiece of this systematic system is that it either says, no, fluency is fine, let's just check maybe whether comprehension is an issue, or it tells you that actually fluency is a bit of a problem for this pupil or these pupils. I wonder whether there is something underpinning this in terms of phonics. And if there is, when it comes to decoding, something underpinning in terms of phonics, you might do a phonics assessment to check that, which will look at code knowledge, blending and segmenting, or in other words, phonemic skills. And it might look at decoding of polysyllabic words if it's a really good assessment. It might look at those individual things and allow you to target interventions. Or, as I say, it might say to you that, you know what, that stuff's fine. It's just monitored reading practice that these kids need. Just one very quick thing to notice, one quick thing to mention, which I really like about fluency assessments, is that once you've done a few of them, you begin to know where a phonics assessment is likely to go with these pupils. If you hear a pupil read for a minute, and particularly or a couple of minutes, and you do this with lots of kids, you start to notice that, oh, actually, this kid's really struggling with blending. They seem to be fine with recognizing the relationships between letters and sounds, but how they work, no, they're lost. They need support with blending. Or you might say, yeah, this kid's decoding individual words accurately, but it's very slow. This is purely a fluency issue. I need to give this kid monitored practice. So even if you don't do phonics assessments as part of your systematic approach, though I would advise that you do for these pupils, you can get a lot of this information from fluency assessments. And the best thing about regular fluency assessments alongside regular comprehension assessments is that it puts teachers in a situation where they have heard every pupil read, usually at the start of the year. So I think that's a really good way, firstly, to get to know your class in terms of their reading capabilities, but also in terms of their confidence in reading as well. So to sum up, a systematic and I think fairly pragmatic way of looking at assessment across the school is to say, okay, we need comprehension assessment of some form to look at progress, to look at how our reading curriculum is working more generally, though there are other things you can do to look at your reading curriculum, of course. We need a fluency assessment alongside that to begin to work out what the individual issues might be. And we also need some kind of decoding or phonics assessment for those who show up on our fluency assessment as really struggling to decode individual words. So I'd say those three things are like the key aspects of a systematic approach. The one thing to note about that stuff is that's kind of what I'd say year 2 and beyond. And what I haven't talked about is that stage before, reception and year 1. And I'd like to do that briefly, if I may. In reception in year 1, the things you're really looking for are spoken language development and decoding, because they're right at the beginning of their journey, and their spoken language development is a very good proxy for what their language comprehension is going to be like, and their decoding is the beginnings of that word recognition stuff. And if their phonics seems to be progressing in the way that you want it to, fine. If it isn't, and this will be looked at through kind of regular informal formative assessment, then those are the pupils that you want to support in terms of the coding. If there seem to be fairly significant issues relating to spoken language, then this is where you would start to have conversations with your SENCO and start to say, well, maybe there are interventions that might be supportive here, or maybe there's something that requires more specialist support. And the last thing to say about all of this is that this systematic approach to assessment that I advocate, and none of this is new, I've not come up with this. This is just sensible stuff that other people have said and I agree with. The other thing to say about all of this is this does not mean that this is everything that you do. It's systematic and pragmatic, but it's not comprehensive. There are things that a SENCO will want to assess and look at relating to literacy and reading more specifically that go beyond this approach. And you always want to make sure that whenever you're doing this stuff, that your SENCO is in the loop in case there are other things that you want to dive more deeply into and find more about, but you as a classroom teacher or a literacy coordinator or reading lead don't have the expertise to deal with there and there.
That's fascinating stuff, Chris. There are a few things that stand out to me, and I think I've got two questions, but they almost link together. So we're talking about how things are relative to peers in terms of where we expect pupils to be. Does that mean that in different contexts, perhaps different parts of the country, you might have different expectations? And am I right in thinking that the fluency research up until relatively recently was conducted in the United States of America, but that there might be an English equivalent? And does that relativity match up on a national scale as well as on a local level?
So I'll answer the first bit first. I mean, ideally, a struggling reader is a struggling reader, and we're probably more likely to be looking at a kind of a national basis and saying that actually a school in one area might have 40% of pupils that we think are struggling, and another school, it might be 5%. And this is, one of those interesting things when people talk about, when Ofsted talk about the 20% that schools need to focus upon. And some schools interpret that as, well, it's the 20% of our readers, full stop, that we need to make sure we're doing something for. I'm pretty confident that that's not what Ofsted mean. They mean, as a rough rule, those 20% that are struggling the most, nationally, and what percentage that is of your of a given cohort in your school is likely to differ. But in pragmatic terms, the reality usually is that you've got a certain amount of resources, and when it comes to supporting pupils, and if 90% of the pupils in your school are really struggling to read, it isn't likely that you've got 9 times as much of the kind of teaching assistant time and time to deliver one-to-one support and interventions as a school that's got 10% of struggling readers. So while the percentages in your school might look different, and while we should be looking at kind of more national picture to get a sense of where our pupils are at, the reality is that we make decisions when it comes to prioritization that is based in our school. And it might be that you can support a particular, like 30 or 40% of your pupils to a really high level in terms of intervention, and those above that need to work in the classroom. Or it might be 20%, or it might be something else. But yeah, if in doubt, I would say you're looking at things on kind of a more national level to get a sense, so that you're not, swayed too much by your local circumstances or individual cohorts at a given moment. In terms of this national picture, it's definitely true to say that the research done by Hasbrook and Tyndall that looked into expected fluency rates was done in the United States, and that's been, I think it was, there's a brilliant little translation that Neil Armand did of that, and you can find that on Twitter, which takes that and says, well, actually, if that's grade 2 in the United States, then that is the equivalent of year 3 over here. Now it isn't perfect, nor could it be, because of the different types of reading instruction, the ages at which pupils kind of begin phonics and this kind of stuff. But it's also worth noting that organisations like Fisher Family Trust have done a lot of work in terms of fluency and fluency assessments over the last couple of years, and are building up a fairly extensive body of knowledge that is applicable to kind of England. I think it's England rather than kind of the UK more broadly. I'd need to check that. And I like to think that that kind of information is going to be disseminated into the public sooner rather than later, which will mean that it's easier for a school in, be it Plymouth or Newcastle or wherever it might be, to be able to say, well, where should our pupils be roughly at this point? With, of course, all of the caveats that I've already said and put in place about the fact that that stuff is purely based on age norms rather than anything that's set in stone.
I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense and makes the picture clear in my mind. I really like that national level comparison. When you're talking, it feels a lot like early years, in as much as when I'm teaching a child to count, I've got my 3 core, so to speak, principles of counting, and perhaps 2 additional ones, depending on where we are. And it's really the skill of the teacher during a counting activity in drawing out what's missing. Is that the case in the situation you're describing? It felt as if people should be able to go somewhere. And does that exist in a place, or will people have to look for those?
So in terms of comprehension assessments, fluency assessments, and phonics assessments, which I think you're kind of referring to here, I would say that unless I'm mistaken, there needs to be a phonics assessment that comes as part of your school's phonics program. So I would lean into that. Again, there are programs out there that you can use that provide a phonics assessment that is aligned with your school's phonics program. It's worth noting, though, that when we're talking about an assessment of phonics that's aligned with your school's phonics program, that alignment only really matters for the first couple of years, because you're saying, oh, okay, we're halfway through year 1, we've done this much of the phonics program, are pupils on track? And when we say it aligns with your school's phonics program, all we're saying is, well, they've learned this sequence. So they're up to this stage in the sequence, they've learned these grapheme, phoneme correspondences. So that's the stuff we need to assess. And because different phonics programs deliver them at different times and in different orders, the assessment has to align with that. But once a kid's in, year 3, year 4, year 5, I don't think it particularly matters if you're using the phonics assessment of your school. I mean, ideally do so, because it will be there, it will be available. But once kids are a bit older, a phonics assessment is a phonics assessment. You're looking at common grapheme phoneme correspondences. Do they recognize them within words? Can they blend words? And ideally, in polysyllabic words, are they able to decode those as well? And that is likely to involve them kind of chunking those polysyllabic words on some level. So then being able to say, okay, here's a word like beautiful. I can look that as beautiful. So they decode that piece by piece and then push it together. And being able to flexibly break words into syllables is a really useful skill for kids. And some kids take to that quite naturally, and some really benefit from explicit instruction and really need that more than others. So yeah, that's one of those things to look out for. Just one thing I'd like to add as well. So I kind of talked about assessment and then what we do as a result of assessment, all kind of rolled into one. So if I may, I'd like to just quickly consolidate that. So I talked about comprehension strategies if fluency seems okay, but comprehension's a bit off. I talked about fluency practice, i.e. one-to-one if possible, or perhaps small group monitored guided reading with feedback for pupils whose fluency isn't where you want it to be, but decoding of individual words seems fine. And then for those who are struggling with decoding individual words, we're looking at particular things. If it's code knowledge, we teach that. And ideally, if necessary, we are then looking at the sequence that's part of our school's phonics program. But it might just be that blending's a problem. If so, focus just on blending. They don't necessarily need to go through the steps of the phonics program, grapheme phoneme correspondence by grapheme phoneme correspondence. They might just need lots of practice of blending. Equally, polysyllabic words might be an intervention that is supportive there. The reason I mention that in particular is that so often when I've worked in kids further up the school, and you'll have heard me say it a lot of times now, regular listeners, so often it's blending that's the issue. When it comes to word recognition, it's blending. It's not code knowledge, it's blending, and it's often blending of polysyllabic words. So that's something to keep an eye out for. But while those are kind of interventions that you can do as a response to particular issues that you've assessed, there's obviously other stuff you can do. If a pupil has a fluency issue in particular, and that's what's holding them back, then that's a useful conversation that you can have with parents at parents' evening to say, actually, you know what? I know we've got this homework and this homework and this homework and this homework, but for a term or two, if you could focus on supporting us with reading at home, if at all possible, fantastic. And we'll keep tabs on that and we'll communicate about that if that's helpful. Equally, you could start thinking about, I guess this is still a sort of intervention, but a slightly different way of thinking about it. Some schools have parent helpers or governors who come in who will read with pupils. Having that list of pupils who struggle with decoding or fluency, who you think, well, that's my struggling readers list or my vulnerable readers list, it's often called. They're going to read with an adult as often as we can possibly support them to, because there's lots of good things we can do in class and there's lots of good things we can do in small group interventions, but nothing quite beats one-to-one reading with an adult who is trained to support. And that brings me on to another quick point. It doesn't take much training for an adult, be it a parent, a volunteer, a teaching assistant, or a teacher, to really maximize what they get out of one-to-one reading when they're supporting pupils. In particular, getting them to model how to decode an individual word when pupils get stuck, encouraging pupils to summarize or ask questions as they're reading to make sure that they are kind of comprehending or attempting to comprehend as well. So doing those things is, just another thing to add to the list of jobs that a reading lead or a literacy coordinator or a classroom teacher might consider.
Nice. I mean, those sort of roles were one of the first to go during the pandemic because the demographics, certainly in my experience, were amongst the most vulnerable at the sort of the peak, because of the age bracket that they would typically fall into. They're normally retired, they want to come back in, they want to give support to the school or the community that they've sort of had success in. And so I think, hopefully those are starting to come back into schools. Should mention that Neil's talk on the TDAPE YouTube, not his most recent one, his first one, about which is just more about reading in general. It references that paper and it shows you his things. So if anyone was interested in Neil's comparison between the sort of fluency rates in grades and year groups, well worth checking out.
Just to drop in there before we move on, there are some, by the way, keep an eye out in your local area. There are national programs that attempt to get local people, kind of get them CRB checked and say, okay, brilliant, let's get you into schools to support young readers. So keep an eye out for these programs. I mean, it seems to me like a little bit of low-hanging fruit that's potentially out there. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of people in their later years who I'm sure would be delighted to work in schools and to come in and volunteer and to continue to make a really valuable contribution to their community. And there are lots of schools that would be absolutely delighted for the support. So if anyone from the government is listening and thinking, I wonder what a larger scale scheme could be to support this, it's perhaps something to look into, because I know that some areas have done this sort of thing quite successfully.
How long do you think the Chris Such training video would be? 10 minutes?
On how to read one-to-one with 10 minutes tops. Again, as with anything I'm talking about today, the assessment, bodies of knowledge behind reading, you can go into it in infinite detail and you can just go on and on and on, but there's a pragmatic kind of stopping point. And I think for that sort of thing, you go past about 10 minutes and it's too much to take in one go. And so you've got diminishing returns, but 10 minutes tops.
Nice. We could sell that for charity. So there's something to think about.
Yeah, well, the one downside to that, and the one reason why I've not actually thought about doing something, or I've not done something like this already, is that when you're doing one-to-one reading, and I guess this is something I should have already noted, when you're decoding words with kids, there might be particular gestures that are used at different schools compared to, you know, the phonics program that's in place. So, for example, I know some phonics programs will, when decoding a word, they'll use something like a chopstick or a pencil, and they'll point at the individual letters, and then when they come to blend the whole word, they'll then slide that underneath. So it's dot 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 slide. And so if that's the routine, the gesture that kids are already really familiar with, makes sense to do that in when kids are reading in school. And that's kind of one of the things that you would drop into that kind of support you'd give to parent volunteers, teaching assistants, etc. So because that's a little bit school specific, I'm slightly reluctant to try and do something nationwide. And also, why should anyone listen to me in the first place? So there's that as well.
So there we go. I really enjoyed listening to those old questions, some really interesting chats that we've had over the years, and more to come as we move into year 5. All that's left to do is say Merry Christmas, you filthy animals, and a Happy New Year.